So I want to contrast the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank by Foster Associates with the other kind of big high-tech monument of the 1980s, and that's Lloyd's of London, a building in central London by Richard Rogers Partnership. Lloyd's had a slightly different program than Hong Kong Bank. Instead of being a pure office building, it was the headquarters for the exchange. In other words, where the transactions actually happen, the sort of face-to-face, but also the electronic transactions that made the insurance exchange go. Lloyd's a long-standing financial institution in London, but one that wanted to update its image, to portray itself as kind of with the times and capable of keeping up with advances, particularly in electronic financing. So hiring Rogers, who had, of course, been half responsible for the Pompidou, made sense. The idea was that Lloyd's would be a kind of agile building that could be reconfigured, just as the Pompidou was supposedly able to be reconfigured. And Lloyd's was done at almost exactly the same time as Hong Kong Bank. And as you can see, it takes kind of Rogers' approach to showing off every piece of the building, right? The kind of richness or complexity of servicing in particular, and literally makes that the aesthetic of the building. Like just like Pompidou takes the building and turns it inside out. At Hong Kong Bank, the idea is that there's a single image that things are either kind of accentuated or suppressed based on how they contribute to the clarity of the expression. At Lloyd's, there's this kind of almost riot of ductwork and fire stairs and elevators, toilet rooms, things like that. And you can see that the section looks in some ways like Pompidou, that all of the services are turned to the exterior where they form the building elevations. In the center now, there are these thick floor plates that have mechanical services below, electronic services within the floor, and then these clear span floor plates that can be reconfigured as the business changes. All of those surround a central atrium that is analogous to Hong Kong Bank's banking hall. And you can see the escalators, which form the kind of dynamic ornament to the space, as well as the kind of energy of having all of these insurance brokers essentially in one large room. On the right, you see a plan of the ground floor, and you can see how all of the fire stairs, all of the mechanical systems, all the elevators have been taken out of what would usually be the core, which leaves the center of the building open for this atrium, and instead plugged in to the outside of what in plan is actually a fairly simple building, right? Just a simple rectangular floor plate, but with all of these kind of pods clipped onto it. On the left, you see typical cladding, and you see how Rogers has expressed both the depth of the floor and the hollow nature of the floor on the exterior. And on the right, you see very much in a way like Piano's IBM Pavilion, how the servicing from these mechanical towers really kind of creeps along the side of the building and plugs in to the cladding underneath, in this case, the windows. Again, everything is shown off. Even the wind bracing for the story-to-story curtain wall, as you can see, is an aluminum extrusion that's then punched, which reduces weight, but of course increases fabrication costs. That is fine for Rogers, right? He wants to celebrate the act of fabrication, right? The complexities of fabrication. And so you get this kind of super or maybe even hyper articulate both structure and cladding system. Where that really takes off, though, is that Rogers believes in expressing every piece of the mechanical system. So unlike Foster, unlike Kahn, where there's a zone in the building that is designated for mechanical, everything is corralled into that so that the served space can be clear. Rogers certainly believes in that, but he doesn't believe in corralling the mechanical systems so much as jumbling them together, right, or collaging them together. So a typical core that you see in the middle, and core, of course, in quotes, because it's not in the core of the building, it's on the exterior. The fire stair, a prefabricated toilet room, just like in Hong Kong Bank. Here, a pipe riser, the mechanical risers for supply and exhaust, and then the elevators that you see here. This is a typical elevator cab, and you can see that he's done this sort of high wire act of building the entire thing out of glass so that you see absolutely every piece. The kind of local air conditioner for the elevator is slung underneath it, and often we would just conceal all of the pipes and things, but Rogers, of course, wants to show it off. And here on the right, you can see there are much cheaper ways to make a fire stair than to literally wrap all of the stairs and the stair passages in stainless steel, but that's what he's done. Toilet rooms in the back served by mechanical systems. And here you see one of the window washing cabs, in addition to having an enormous amount of surface area requiring a great deal of fabrication, a great deal of insulation. This approach, of course, in a smoggy environment like London's requires constant maintenance. So those cabs, are part of the kind of aesthetic, sort of dynamic ornament. And Rogers' approach to detailing, again, is to show everything off. So the stair treads that you see here are aluminum extrusions, and instead of putting a cap onto the end, Rogers plasters the edge of the extrusion up against the edge of the stringer, so that you literally see the section. You see exactly how it's made. And that kind of overemphasis of individual pieces, depending on your point of view, either gives you this sort of chaotic, sort of organized chaos, or gives you all kinds of opportunities to kind of enter into the story of how the building is realized, right? How it's put together, how the individual pieces are fabricated. The elevations, of course, are maybe Lloyd's most famous expression, and here all of those cores on the outside, if you know what you're looking for, you can see the logic of the building, right? You can see the floor plates behind it. You can see how the cores are kind of attached to it. But to the layperson, right, this is like a rocket gantry has landed in the middle of central London. Like Pompidou, it was immensely controversial, and like Pompidou, it often gets voted both the most popular and the least popular building in London. But it did the job for Lloyd's. It put the company on the map as a kind of technically savvy, agile corporation that was, willing to take a chance on a relatively young architect, though one who at that point was a little more experienced than Foster was when he took on Hong Kong Bank, but also making a statement about the flexibility of the building and a kind of anti-monumental monument, if you like, right? A building that's much more about the provision of services in the way that Rayner Banham would have argued, than the creation of a civic gesture per se. Now, Lloyd's is absolutely a monument, right? It is recognizable. It is a signature building, and it has not changed much in the 40 plus years since it's opened, 30 plus years since it's opened. So it is this kind of monumental anti-monument, right, or a technological monument, seemingly a contradiction in terms, but one that I think is kind of worthy of the name. Now, there were, of course, contextual arguments to be made against Lloyd's, that it wasn't a particularly sensitive addition to the historic fabric of central London, the city, as it's called. But there are also good technical arguments that were made against it as well. And in particular, in a relatively cold climate like London's, this is a very inefficient way to lay out a building. If you think about all of the insulation required for that exposed supply ductwork, right, you're spending a lot of energy, a lot of carbon to heat or cool air that you're then putting into these ducts that have to sort of fight the colder temperature outside to get where they're going. And the sort of general criticism, right, was that, ducts maybe belong on the inside, right? There's a reason that we put fragile, vulnerable services into protected areas, right, like Kahn's brick towers or like Foster's exterior cores. And this sort of jesting image made to critique Lloyd's has some validity to it, right? That services can't just go anywhere, that they do have to be maintained and cleaned and all that when they go on the exterior. Nevertheless, the visual effect, the visual impact of all of these services and the kind of sublime complexity of Lloyd's has made it very popular among certain people anyway, certain critics and a segment of the public. And it stands, I think, in the city. There's this very kind of unique situation where it's located very near National Westminster Tower, which had been the tallest building in Great Britain when it opened in 1980 by Richard Seaford. Lloyd's in the middle of 1986. And Foster's project for Swiss Re, another insurance concern in 2003, often called the Gherkin, which to my mind, this really sets the tone or explains the difference between Foster's approach, which I would argue is kind of rationalist in a way, right? It's looking for the big generative idea that then defines a lot of the approach to detailing, versus Rogers, who is a true empiricist and is willing to take every single piece at face value and assemble it more into a collage than into a wholly unified architectural statement. And we will come back to Rogers and Piano and Foster's when we talk about sustainability in the next lecture. But I do just want to point out that their careers did kind of go on in these directions where Rogers' work, especially in the 90s, is very kind of detail-oriented, very component-oriented, still very much a kind of collage approach. Foster's was more systematic, looking for, again, overarching ideas, but also for integration of things like structure and services instead of trying to separate them out. And the project that I want to use to make the transition to our lecture on sustainability, which is coming up next, may seem odd at first. The airport, Stansted Airport, that Foster Associates designed north of London, started in 1981, finished in 1991. Airports we don't think of generally as particularly sustainable projects, right, because of the nature of the transportation that they house. And yet Stansted is an important, I think, transition between that kind of interest in expressive technology and maybe overemphasis of structure into, at least in Foster's case, something that is a little more holistic and that's looking more at the performance of building, in particular the environmental performance, and how those can be integrated with structure, mechanical systems, and function as well. And the structure that I want to look at Stansted is the main kind of head house. So this structure right here, which as we'll see is composed of a series of modules where the office really broke down the functional problem of an airport to its basics. And the way they did this was they looked at the airports that the London Airport Authority had built in the previous 20 years, the terminal buildings at Heathrow and Gatwick. And they said that they had sort of come up with this standard approach that on one level makes sense, that there's a raised floor up above a kind of service level below. And then above the raised floor, all of the mechanical systems, the plant, the air handlers, the chillers, all of that goes on the roof, and then ductwork gets distributed in the ceiling zone. And what Foster's office realized was that in doing this, you were basically sealing off any possibility of bringing in daylight. And you were also putting a fairly heavy dynamic load on top of some very tall columns, right? 9 meters is roughly the height that the airport authority wanted. They're up against a height limit for the overall building because of aviation concerns. So all of these problems, Foster said, compounded by the fact that the services are now difficult to get to. And in analyzing these, Foster's not done an airport yet, so they're starting from scratch. They have the kind of innocent asking questions where they say, well, why don't you just take all the plant and put it down underneath the concourse instead of above the concourse? And that does several things. Within the height limit, you get an additional 2 or 3 meters of space in the concourse. You get a lighter roof, therefore you can use less structure. Easy access to the plant, right? You can bring in trucks and you can drive in the air handlers underneath the concourse. And then finally, because the roof is so thin, you can bring in as much daylight as you want. And this, to my mind, is a great example of an integrated approach, one that's trying to not only use and express the latest technology, but to find overlaps or to find complementary ways of developing structure and mechanical and lighting systems in this case. And for Stansted, this all came down to this one very light structural module, what they called the mushroom. And it's very similar in some ways to the Firth of Forth Bridge, just in 2 dimensions instead of 1. That you have this kind of compression tower in the middle. You have compression struts that hold the edges of the roof up, and then you have these shallow steel lattice work domes that hold up the roof cladding and the ceiling within. And you can see some of the versions that they went through there on the left. The one in the middle, you can see that there's a little compression pyramid on top of the large kind of column structure, and then tension elements that go out to the edges of the struts to keep the roof in equilibrium. And you can see too that within the roof structure, there's just a relatively small skylight, and yet that skylight, something like 8 or 10% of the roof structure, is enough even on a cloudy day to illuminate the interior all the time. And so in 1991, long before airport authorities were thinking about questions of sustainability, Foster's is also able to say, during the day, you don't have to turn the lights on at all, right? Which is a cost savings, a life cycle cost savings, we would call it today, a savings in energy costs that the airport's certainly not going to say no to. Now, interestingly, all of those kind of functional benefits are compounded by what I would think of as an architectural benefit, that approach to integrating a module, trying to solve structural, enclosure, lighting, environmental issues with one integrated solution gives you a very, very clean finished product. And all of the signage, all of the electronics, all of the communications, all of those things also get integrated into the space within these kind of super columns. You can see the communication modules kind of populating those as you go down the rank of structure. Very, very open plan because the structure has such a minimal footprint, in part because the roof is so lightweight, and one that enables the airport to then come in and kind of reconfigure as needed. For better or for worse, the way the airport ended up doing that was filling it with shops, right? So the clarity of the space, where the idea was you could get out of your car, look through this entire structure and see the planes on the other side. And in reality, what you see are newspaper shops and things like that. But this, as we'll see, was a real turning point for Foster's office, the realization that you could integrate all of these systems, that you could sell the fact that the building was energy efficient, and the fact that at the end of the day, all of this integration created a clear, legible piece of architecture is something that would stick with the firm and would, I think, fundamentally change the way that it approached, especially big design, going forward. In all of this, the high-tech movement, while it seems to, in some ways, come out of nowhere, right? And part of the rhetoric is that you're clearing the decks and starting again, thinking from scratch. In fact, there is a really long history and a long legacy. In some ways, everything we've looked at in this class is in the kind of playbook for these high-tech designers, but particularly some of the previous generations' work. The approach of Charles and Ray Eames, the willingness to take things off the shelf, collage them in ways that make architectural sense. This is something I think that you see in Roger's work. In Kahn's work, especially the honoring the engineering, but finding ways to manipulate it that create kind of unified or clear architectural statements, as he did with Commandant's Vierendeel precast beams at Richards. And several elements from Prouvé. One, the interest in designing the component, treating the component as an industrial or product design problem. but thinking through also the building increasingly in ways that Prouvé did with his Maison Tropicale, of thinking about how the materials could be part of an environmental or a climatic or a human comfort story. And the fact that Banham in particular is writing in this era about the importance of mechanical systems, the growing importance of mechanical systems to architecture in the late 20th century, is something that is sort of omnipresent. Banham's work is interesting because he not only wrote about the history of climate response and mechanical systems, but he was also something of a theorist about these. And he was part of a movement, particularly in the late 1960s, that saw in architectural technology a way to address social and cultural issues that were becoming really, really fraught, especially in 1968. And so Banham, among other things, embarked on this series of theoretical projects with a French illustrator, François Dallegré. And one of these projects was what he called the environment bubble, or the enviro bubble, where he made the distinction between mechanical services that were getting more and more elaborate, and you can see the kind of core piece there in the middle, and architectural skins that he argued were getting thinner and less substantial. And think about Willis Faber, the structural glass skin that'll come along in about 7 years here. The environment bubble was clearly tongue-in-cheek. Banham's idea was that you would have this mechanical pod that would have air conditioning and kitchen equipment and, of course, a hi-fi stereo, and you'd be able to surround that with an inflatable dome that you could take anywhere, right? So here, camping out basically on a rock outcrop, and as he put it, having soft music by Dionne Warwick in the background as you're populating places out in the wilderness. There were more architectural manifestations of this as well, though. The metabolists in Japan, which started out as a theoretical movement that was also very interested in kind of making statements about the new nature of society, the new mobility that automobiles and aircraft and high-speed trains were giving people. But also slightly, I think, ironically, but also with a genuine interest, looking at the way that space technology might transform architecture as well. And maybe the most famous of these was Kisho Kurokawa's Nagakin Capsule Tower, done in 1972, and actually just now, unfortunately, being demolished. And here on the left, you see both the overall capsule. So this is space for one person. It has sleeping, it has a rudimentary kitchen, it has a prefabricated bathroom made out of stainless steel sheeting. The idea was that these would all be made in the factory, much like the prefabricated bathrooms that would later go on Hong Kong Bank and Lloyd's of London. They'd be trucked to the site, just like the shipping containers that you see in the foreground of the photo, and picked up by crane and sort of plugged into these gantry towers. Nagakin was built. It was reasonably successful as both a kind of short-term hotel or short-term apartment building or long-term hotel, however you want to think about it. There were other ideas about this that were a little bit crazier. The predecessor to the Pompidou was actually an unbuilt, probably unbuildable project by Cedric Price in 1964, a member of the London Circle that also included Archigram, another group that sort of played with the idea of technology as a language, as a kind of, in science fiction, as a kind of provocative architectural language. So for the Fun Palace, Cedric Price said that, if you wanted to have a museum or a cultural facility, what you really needed to do was to build a giant gantry crane that could carry elements that would make up space for concerts or art exhibits or just plain, in the term of the day, happenings. And you would have these escalators that could go to different platforms and that could be swiveled around depending on how things would be reconfigured. This, I think, is clearly the inspiration for the Pompidou, or one of the inspirations for the Pompidou. But things like it got built as well. And another metabolist project was the so-called Symbol Zone for Expo 70 in Tokyo, where literally a fun palace is built that is this giant space frame, not a gantry crane, but a space frame that shelters and provides lighting and sound for all kinds of happenings that can go on in the space below. And if you look closely at the photo here, this is an ad for the contractor. This ultra modern architecture, right? Ultra modern being both in some cases tongue in cheek, in this case, I think completely non-ironic. You can see that space frame has all of the gizmos that are going to help make the performances below happen. They have gantry towers with elevators and stairs so that you can get up into the space frame yourself as an audience member. And in that space frame, they have a capsule home by Kisho Kurokawa. And down on the main floor, you can see there are these giant moving robots, right, that are designed by Arata Isozaki, who will go on to become a fairly well-known and actually fairly conservative postmodern architect in Japan in the 1980s. Also at Expo 70, there are inflatables. This is the Fuji Group, which is a manufacturer of film, and they hire this pneumatics engineer, Yukata Murata, to design a structure that is almost not there, in their words. It is inflated, and projectors inside show all kinds of films so that you walk in, and in the words of critic Martin Pauly, the building itself disappears and all you see is the kind of content, right? So almost a sort of early definition of what today we might call virtual reality. Here, instead of being done electronically, it's done pneumatically. And if you kind of look farther afield, I think you see the idea that technological expressionism is also a way to critique the growing influence of technology and the growing interest in optimization and the way that might actually dehumanize us, right? That maybe we're losing something when we focus so much on technology and less on traditional forms maybe of monumentality. The interiors and the kind of designed objects in dystopian films like 2001 show this really clearly, right? That these are structures or environments or objects that have this kind of very, very weird, unsettling feel to them. The kind of constant fluorescence of the space station in 2001, where there are all these kind of almost like in-jokes where the brands are familiar, right? Hilton Hotels as an outpost on this space station, but the environments are completely alienating, right? People almost kind of don't even belong in them. And of course, the kind of possibility for technology to be used not only for good purposes but for evil purposes. And 2001, of course, does this very nicely, right? Talks about how technology as a lever can help us do good things, or it can go off the rails and do kind of evil things as well. High tech itself is very much a kind of synthetic movement. It has a lot of heroes that are scattered throughout history and from all kinds of sort of theoretical standpoints. To my mind, one of the most interesting ones is Foster's sort of list of heroes or precedents. That would, of course, include Kahn. It would, of course, include Mies. It would, of course, include Buckminster Fuller. And the idea that there are many different routes that technological expression can take, whether that's the kind of very bitty, kind of overly detailed version of Rogers, whether that's the obsession with daylight, with layering, kind of unpeeling of a building that piano does, or whether that's the search for like clear, legible ideas that can be expressed with the minimum of distraction, that I think is one of Foster's main tenets. All these will continue to kind of chug along, and in the face of new problems, but also new materials, new techniques, they will all be kind of transformed in some ways together, in some ways along these kind of different lines, when environmental issues become dominant in the way that we seek to put our architectural resources to work against the larger problems that we face as designers.